Hello everyone, and welcome to the Leverage Point webinar. Leverage Point is the only cloud value-based platform for companies changing the way they create, communicate, and capture value. Thank you for joining us for preparing the sales team to win with 21st Century Procurement Organizations. This is Taylor Meekum, Leverage Point's Marketing Manager, and I am pleased to moderate our session today. I'd like to welcome all of you to another one of our monthly webinars on value-based strategy. During the webinar, if you have any specific questions or comments, please feel free to enter them in the right-hand panel in the questions section. Later, we'll respond to as many of them as we can. On exiting today's webinar, please remember to complete our quick survey. If you do so, you will receive a copy of our white paper addressing B2B sales challenges using value propositions as an effective sales tool, and a copy of Selling to Procurement by Chris Provine. We are delighted to have with us again noted pricing thought leader and author Chris Provine. Chris is a healthcare and medical technology expert with over 20 years of industry experience. He's held executive roles at Johnson Johnson and Siemens Healthcare. Currently, he runs his own consultancy, Vantage Partners, where he shares his expertise and trains global clients in the areas of strategic pricing, value selling, and sales negotiation. He is also author of multiple books on selling to procurement and on pricing and sales in healthcare, including the most recent, Healthcare Value Selling. Chris also is a popular adjunct professor at Rutgers University. I know there are many folks watching today who are very eager to hear what Chris has to say about preparing sales teams for procurement. So with that, Chris Provine, welcome.
Great, thanks Taylor. It's great to be with you and for all of you in the audience. Thanks for taking time out of your day to spend some time with us, and we'll try to make it worth your while. So, what we wanted to talk about today is really this movement to the 21st Century Procurement Organization that many companies have done. And we're going to talk generally about organizations that sell from one business to another, so B2B sales. We're going to take a look at this B2B sales from the procurement perspective. So what do you need to do if you're in sales, if you're in marketing, if you're leading a sales organization? How do you need to be able to, how do you think about this 21st Century Procurement Organization? What is a 21st Century Procurement Organization? And then what are some things that you should be doing as a sales organization to really prepare yourselves to win with this organization? Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about today. We know that if you look across industries, industries are very different points in terms of the maturity of the industry itself in the procurement practices that go on in the industry. So we probably have a mix of industries on the phone call this afternoon with a webinar. Recognize that some industries have been dealing with very aggressive procurement organizations and much more mature procurement organizations than other industries. So part of what we'll try to level set here is, generally when an industry matures from a procurement standpoint, what does that look like? What does it mean for people selling into that industry? And then how do you prepare as a sales and marketing organization to be successful in that environment? Okay. So let's start out. I'd love to use this little quote to start. And for those of you who are in sales or in marketing, working with sales, just read this quote up here and ask yourself, is this the market you're selling into today? So a seismic shakeup is altering the relationship between buyers and sellers. In industry after industry, buyers have become more demanding, questioning price, choosing generics, and negotiating harder. And as I travel around the world and talk to sales leaders and sales teams and marketing colleagues, what I often hear is that exactly that's what's happening in our business. And the interesting thing to note here is actually this quote is from 1995. So I found this on the inside jacket of a book that was in my library, and I thought it was pretty interesting that back in 1995, and you could go back 20 years before that and 20 years before that, B2B sales organizations have historically been challenged with the professional buying organizations and some of the tactics, pressures, and strategies that they use. So this isn't new. I'll say what is new, though, is if you look across industries, there's a recognition that procurement is a much more important function today than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And if you look at all of the pundits out there who do research in this space, what they would clearly say is if you look at procurement 10 years from today, in most industries, it's going to be much more important than it is today. So whether you like it or not, if you're in sales and you've got to sell through or to professional buying organizations at your customers, you have to learn how to navigate these organizations. You've got to become successful at it. And the good news, I think, is as these professional organizations mature, often it presents an opportunity for those suppliers and the sales teams that are really ready to take advantage of this. And we'll talk about some of this as we go. I think the other interesting thing here, and it's 2015, we're 5 or 6 or 7 years post the Great Recession. Now, I'll give you some statistics as we go along here. If you look at a very recent survey of chief procurement officers and said, what are your top challenges or top goals or top pressure you have? Interestingly, the one that shows up at the top, that usually always shows up on the top of that list, and is finding savings. So how do you take costs out of the business? Now, in the most recent survey, I saw 51% of the CPOs or chief procurement officers said that's their number one goal. Actually, interestingly, that's much further down. That's gone down since the Great Recession, which kind of makes sense. Businesses were under lots of pressure to take costs out after the Great Recession. As we've moved past that, and there's been waves and waves of sourcing to try to take costs out of the business, what you see is taking costs out become less of a focus and other things become more of a focus. And we'll talk about that as we go, because I think for many sales teams and sales leadership, this represents a big opportunity. Okay, so I said that if you talk to pundits and said, you know, if you look out 10 years, will procurement be more or less important for most businesses and most industries? And clearly people say, we think it's going to be even more important in the future than it is today. And we know that's mixed by industry, but generally it's a trend across industries. So you ask, why is that the case? And there's really, there's a bunch of things you could point to. I think these 5 or so here on this list, I think get to why procurement, why supply chain management, and why suppliers are going to be much more important for businesses in the future. You know, number one is globalization. Globalization has done a lot of things. One of the things it's done is opened up opportunities for finding new and different suppliers who have different capabilities and also different cost structures, right? It's also lengthened the supply chain in many industries, so you're not only getting products locally or services locally, even you're sourcing them from around the world, which creates complexity and risk in your business and your supply chain. The next is continued pressure on costs and growth. Businesses continue to need to grow. The leading edge procurement organizations and businesses recognize that suppliers are a great potential opportunity to help them grow. So growing through your suppliers and using supplier innovation is big. Shorter product life cycles is driving the need for a more important procurement function. They'll have to source more frequently. They'll have to be on top of whatever they're buying in a new and deeper way. Next is the growth, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in terms of outsourcing and what I call is solution sourcing. So organizations are moving out of just buying a widget to thinking about how do I actually get a solution and how do I start to source from a procurement standpoint a solution rather than a product. And then the last one is around the world, the supply markets and the supply chain is getting much more complex and much more risky. So you put all of this together, you say, boy, the procurement organization ought to be a lot more important in the future than it is today. And you're likely to see the procurement organizations in many businesses becoming more and more sophisticated and having more and more clout in terms of picking suppliers and picking solutions. Okay? And as I say this, just recognize that that doesn't mean that the users of the solution or other key influences in an organization won't have a big impact on the buying decision. They always do and always will. The point of this is, over time, I would expect that the professional buyers will have more and more clout and more influence on the buying decision. Okay, so one of the things we talked about is suppliers' offerings are becoming more complex. If you go to the left-hand side of the screen here, in the old world, many suppliers sold single products or simple solutions. And if you look at what's happened across many industries, is suppliers, in order to grow their business, in order to fight commoditization, in order to create much more stickiness with their customers, have started to change offerings and started to monetize value in different ways. So we see bundled offerings where there's services plus services or product plus services. There's new business models. So in the airplane engine part of the marketplace, they often price the airplanes based on the amount of miles flown rather than the cost of the engine. And then all the way to the right, you see outsourcing to all different parts of the value chain happening. So I do a lot of work in healthcare. It's interesting. Hospitals these days are outsourcing all kinds of different things, from the emergency room to housekeeping, which is something easy and most businesses have outsourced, to biomedical engineering. They're outsourcing entire specialties, sometimes even the OR, they're outsourcing portions of that. So the suppliers are creating a lot more complexity, and this requires procurement to be much greater skilled in the future. We talked a little bit about business risk, and as I go through this, we'll talk about what, from a selling perspective, how you should think about this. But in general, I think the supply chain pundits out there and experts would say that clearly supply chains have become more risky over time, and here's a recent article in the New York Times that talked about this. The black swan events, I think the picture you see there is from a tsunami in Japan. But the point is, the world has become a little bit less stable, and we have these black swan events that come out. So part of what you have to think about as a sales team and as a sales organization is, from a business risk standpoint, do you have advantages that maybe your competition doesn't have? Do you have multiple plants? Do you have backup when you need it, depending on what you're providing your customers? So thinking about risk is going to be much more important from a buyer's perspective. And therefore, as someone selling to another business, you ought to be thinking about, what is the risk in the supply chain? What is the risk to continuity? And if you do have advantages from a risk standpoint, you should be thinking about is, how do you use that in the sales process, and how do you educate your buyers around the potential risk and using it as a lever point for you. Okay, so business risk is important. What also is increasingly becoming important as transparency accelerates is the risk in the supply chain and in the suppliers that you choose around your reputational risk. So we see this in the chocolate industry. There's a lot of risk due to child labor practices for some of the raw materials. You can go do a Google and look up YouTube videos about Apple and their supply chain, and Foxconn, one of their suppliers in China, and the publicity and bad reputation that comes from some of the practices there around controlling suppliers. So again, part of what you should be doing as a supplier is recognizing that your customers increasingly will have a higher risk orientation as we go forward because of all the things I talked about. And think about what you sell, think about your offering, think about your brand. Do you in turn provide some kind of advantages around risk? And we'll talk about this a little more. Okay, so we're going to talk about a 21st century procurement organization, just to give you a sense of what is this as you're selling into them. And as your customer becomes smarter, and that's what we're going to call a 21st century procurement organization. It's not an old school buyer. We could go through some maturity models, but it's a buyer that is really focused on a few things, and let's talk about these. One of the things that happens as your customer becomes much more sophisticated is they begin to formalize the buying process process, and we'll talk about what that is. So they have a formal way to purchase things. They take a much broader view of value. So the good news there is if you're a supplier who has a clear understanding of your value, you're going to have a real opportunity. They start to segment suppliers and look at suppliers from a strategic standpoint and seek out collaboration with strategic suppliers. And then lastly, they use creative sourcing and negotiation strategies, and we'll talk a bit about those. So what I often tell people is if you're prepared for this new world, it's good. It's really good news that your customers are getting smarter, you're becoming better purchasers. But if you're not prepared, it can be really difficult, and it can be a real challenge, particularly for the frontline salespeople. Okay, and we'll talk about some of the ways that you can deal with that. Okay, so let's jump into the next slide. So what I wanted to just take you through real quickly and give you some insights on is as your customer becomes much more sophisticated and moves to a 21st century purchasing organization, a procurement organization we call it, they usually formalize the buying process, and it looks like something like what you see on the screen. This is what I like to use 6 simple steps. There are other models out there recognized that might be 7 or 8 steps. There's other with 4 steps. But you'll get the general point is when your customers become more formal, they usually have a structured process to buy things. And from a sales perspective, understanding and using this buying process becomes really important when they become formalized. So any buying process starts with step 1, which is excuse me, your customer or someone in the customer's organization recognizes that there is a problem or opportunity that a supplier can help with, okay? And that's really the start of the buying process. The next step is they analyze the opportunity in the supply market. They then move on to developing a sourcing strategy, and we'll talk about that. They move into, excuse me, inviting suppliers and evaluating solutions. Next is select suppliers, negotiate terms, and then lastly, implement the agreement and manage the relationship. So there's always some interesting insights from this. There's research out of the Challenger sales book that says by the time that your supplier invites you and begins to make contact, they've already done 60% of the buying decision. You know, this is something that we teach in procurement. It's something that I teach at the university in global procurement. And from a procurement standpoint, that's not an aha. I know for many in sales, that is an aha statistic. But from a procurement standpoint, this is what we're teaching people to do is go through and do your homework, stages 1 through 3, so that by the time you engage suppliers, you know what you're buying, you have a really clear understanding of the marketplace, you have a clear understanding of your needs as an organization and your goals. And by the time you reach out to suppliers, you're ready, not ready for action as if it's a battle, but you're really ready to get the best value possible. The other interesting statistic is and this is general business to business, we know this differs by industry, is that the average number of people involved in a buying decision, and of course it depends on what they're buying, is 5.4 people. So the old days of working with a user buyer and having an informal relationship and getting them to push things through for you is generally, for most purchases, is going away, particularly if your customer has a formal buying process. So there's a couple other insights from this slide is number 5, step 5 in the process is when they negotiate terms. So when you think about selling your value, recognize that from a buyer standpoint, negotiations is just part of the buying process. It's just one step in the buying process. So you should always be thinking about not only selling your value along this buying process, but also being prepared to negotiate and being able to frame that up well in advance. Of course, the other insight, step 6 in this process, is when the customer is supposed to be doing something called Supplier Relationship Management, or SRM. Basically, what they're supposed to be doing at that point is really working with select strategic suppliers and really managing the relationship. So just like you as in a sales team would have customer relationship management, or CRM, on the buyer side, they have SRM. And this is an opportunity for you. I know that many businesses, the discipline around business reviews and regularly spending time with people in the customer's organization and even the people in procurement and explaining and having a dialogue about the relationship and the value that you delivered is kind of a lost discipline in many companies. And it's actually a lost opportunity, because if you wait till the next buying cycle to start for whatever you're selling, or the contract expiration, if you have a contract that with a customer that is expiring, and you've not been having business reviews, you've not been talking to them about the relationship, you've not been engaging them and educating them on the value you're bringing, you've missed a huge opportunity. So lots of insights from this particular chart. The other one is really get clear and look at this and think about your own sales process. I know some people in sales love process, some people hate process, but just think about your own process if your company doesn't have a process. And how aligned is it with your customer's buying process? So if it's misaligned and you're engaging at the wrong time with the wrong information, you're missing huge opportunities. Okay, so we talked about procurement's focus changing, and I'll bring these up at once here. On the left side is the traditional buyer. So you go back in time before the 21st Century Procurement Organization, and this is what people were doing. And a large part of what their job was is very tactical, administrative type activities. And what companies have tried to do over time by hiring better people and by using technology is to really minimize those tactical activities and really move the buying organization on to much more strategic things. So cost reduction planning, really measuring suppliers' performance, getting in there and really developing innovative supply strategies to get better value from the suppliers. And what you see is on the right-hand side of the slide, which is more outsourcing, new business models, unbundling, which we'll talk about a little bit, new sourcing strategies, optimizing the supply base, which just means most organizations, if they haven't been running a 21st century procurement organization, usually have far too many suppliers. And one of the first things they try to do is go through and optimize the supply base. That simply means getting rid of a lot of suppliers and trying to consolidate their spend on fewer but much more highly qualified suppliers. So again, if you're on the sales side, this is a big opportunity for you, particularly for customers in this transition of trying to optimize the supply base. So one of the things, if you look at the research, and the last research I saw said over 60 or 65% of CPOs or chief procurement officers said they do supplier collaboration and they want to do more of it. And what I've recognized is I've been working with lots of sales teams and also top procurement work in the procurement organization is what you find is oftentimes both sides don't really have a process for collaboration. So this is a model of buyer-seller relationships. So on the horizontal is the degree of trust, communication, goal alignment, integration between the buyer and the seller. On the vertical is joint value creation. So I think almost everyone, if you go to procurement organizations that are 21st century, you talk to them about transactional relationships as opposed to collaborative relationships with suppliers. Virtually all of them would say, of course, we'd want to have collaborative relationships with our strategic suppliers because it creates more value. So their mental model is what you see on this screen. The opportunity for sales teams is, I don't think a lot of people know how to collaborate effectively between the buyer and seller, and there's not great process for doing it. There's not great usually discipline around selecting who are the customers we're going to collaborate with and what does collaboration actually look like. Is that joint projects? Are we giving them innovation in advance? Are we doing other things together that best practices in exchange, those type of things? It's usually fairly ad hoc, and what I've noticed on the buyer side as well is that not all of them know how to do this. So again, from a sales perspective, if you're thinking about selling to a 21st century procurement organization, one of the opportunities is make sure that you have a process for collaboration. Make sure that you and your sales team know how to do this, you know how to pick the right customers based on their behaviors, and you also factor this into part of your negotiation and sales strategy. So I talked about before the awareness of collaboration's impact on the bottom line, and I'll just point to this slide here. This was based on a academic study that was done. We'll go back one slide. That was done by some professors out of Michigan, and one of the schools out in Michigan, not the University of Michigan or Michigan State. And they looked at Chrysler, which they had a lot of data around. Chrysler went from being known a long time ago as a buyer who had lots of collaboration and really thought of in a very collaborative way, and they went through different ownership changes over time about 7, 8, 9 years ago. And what happened is they changed their purchasing practices and changed the way they engaged suppliers. And these academics have estimated that because of this change, moving from a very collaborative relationship with the key suppliers to a transactional and sometimes antagonistic style with their suppliers, they missed out on $24 billion in profits. So it's a pretty interesting read, and I think for those of you who are selling to really difficult buyers who think that they are really sophisticated, this might be a nice article to pass on to them, because it's very clear in the analysis that as Chrysler moved and changed their behavior, they beat up lots of suppliers. And of course, when you beat up suppliers, what happens? Those of you in the sales organization and marketing organizations of suppliers less interested in working with you. They're less interested in bringing you the newest innovation, right? They're not going to come launch that to you first. They're less interested in working with you on cost reduction programs. When you ask them for price reductions, they're much less interested. So the supplier really digs their heels in, and that in turn costs the buyers lots of money. So this is a very interesting study, and it supports the point that collaboration drives greater value. Okay, so one of the other things we talked about as procurement becomes much more sophisticated, one of the things that they started to do, and this has been going on for about a decade or so, is try to find creative ways to buy things. And the interesting case that I like to bring up a lot is if you look at corporate legal services. So big companies hire lots of outside legal counsel to help them on various things, right? It could be patent cases, it could be litigation, it could be all kinds of different things. It could be employee-related stuff. But usually most large companies and most companies spend a fair amount of money on legal services with outside counsel. And what's transpired over the past 10 years or so is procurement's gotten a lot more sophisticated. And because of some of the cost pressures in the businesses, what they've been able to do is something that we call unbundling. And you see this article from HBR. It's about unbundling corporate legal services to unlock value. So basically, from a buyer's perspective, what unbundling really means is if you're a seller and you're selling something that's a service and a service, or a product and a service, and one of those components is highly differentiated and has high value, and another is much less differentiated, but you sell them combined as a bundle. What buyers have recognized is that oftentimes they're overpaying for that bundle. And so they're doing something called unbundling, which is basically taking those bundles and separating those and trying to source those components separately to get a lot more value. And if you look at industries like legal services, it's happened in media and advertising. If you've ever purchased as a consumer a single song off of iTunes, that's unbundling. I mean, in the old days, you used to have to buy an entire album. Now you can buy one song, right? So that's an example of consumer unbundling. Unbundling is happening in cable TV. It's happening everywhere, right? So it's a trend that's out there in many industries. In terms of business to business, it's been going on for about 10 years. I do most of my work in healthcare. And in healthcare, we now see unbundling coming quite a bit, where hospital customers are separating a medical device from the sales or clinical support and saying, I'll take the device at a much lower price, and I'll go provide my own clinical support. I don't need your clinical support. And so they're starting in unbundling, and how prevalent unbundling becomes is an open question across industries. But as a sales team, you need to recognize that it's out there. It's one of the things that I think savvy buyers will try for almost everything that they buy to try to unlock value and save money. And as much as we talk about the sophistication of buyers and how they've changed over time, and the 21st century organization is going to be much more collaborative, they're going to be thinking about value very broadly, they're going to be very innovative. I think the sad truth is often many people in procurement fall back on bad habits, and the bad habits are negotiating far too aggressively. So this little picture is from an article that was in Forbes earlier this year. It's an interesting read if you have time, and it talks about, I think it's in some part of the transportation procurement arena, but it talks about how procurement is just negotiating so aggressively that they're actually putting their suppliers' margins at risk. And it's an interesting read. It's, from my perspective, having spent time on both sides of the table, what I read through the article, what it hit me as is there's two sides to the story here, and I think part of the issue is procurement was negotiating very hard, but also you could get a sense reading the article that the supplier wasn't prepared to deal with it. So part of what you have to do in the sales organization is, if in fact the professional buyer is negotiating far too heavily for whatever they're buying and really using aggressive and coercive tactics, you've got to figure out how to deal with them. And part of this is calling out the behavior and bringing them back to, what type of procurement organization do they have, and what type of relationship do they actually want to have with their suppliers. But it's something to really be aware of, and don't let them take advantage of it. So we'll talk about just a few things around preparing to win with this 21st century procurement organization. I didn't as much get into the organization structure of the 21st century procurement organization and some of the things they do. I'll just give you a quick overview of that. As an organization becomes much more sophisticated, they typically do a couple of things. They tend to organize a little differently, so sometimes they move from a decentralized procurement to more of a hybrid, which means they have a corporate entity, and then they put in some structure at a corporate level, and then at a lower level, if they're a multi-division company, they have leaders within their various divisions, or if you're selling to an organization with multiple plants, it'd be multiple plants. One of the other things they do organizationally is they put in something called category management, which essentially is managing everything that organization buys in categories of spend. So they'll take like items and put them into categories and appoint someone who is in charge of being a strategic expert in that category. So if you're selling to a pharmaceutical company, they might have a category leader who is responsible for buying chemicals for that pharmaceutical company. And that person is responsible for being the expert in the chemical market and really knowing every supplier, what's happening from supply-demand dynamics, what's going on in that industry. So that's what, when you look at a 21st century organization, that's what they do. As well, one of the other things they do is, from a technology standpoint, they usually have pretty sophisticated systems, which from a sales perspective, you say, well, who cares about that? What that actually means is they have pretty good visibility to everything they buy at various prices, and they often have good benchmarks around what they should be paying for that stuff. So maybe 10 or 15 years ago, you could sell to an organization, and they might not have really known how much they buy of whatever you're supplying them, and they might not have good visibility because their systems were terrible. The 21st century organization has very good systems, and it's working actively to improve their systems. They're usually working actively to improve their talent and upgrading the talent in the organization. So in the future, what you'll be selling into is an organization with lots of data and facts, maybe sometimes more than you, an organization with a category management structure, and they might have people who actually know your industry as well as you do or better. and a group of people who may be MBAs and PhDs that you have to deal with, who are fairly sophisticated, savvy folks. So that's what the future looks like, and that's where many companies kind of move their organizations to. And let's talk about how you prepare for that. So part of this is just understanding what do they care about so you can speak their language. And I won't go through every one of these in detail given the time we have here together, but let me just touch on these. Of course, one of their key goals is to reduce costs. That doesn't mean your price all the time. That means taking costs out of the business, right? It could be managing internal stakeholders is something they have to do and manage, and all that means is, as a professional buyer, it's not often that you make the decision. They may act to the sales team as if they're making the decision, but that's not really true. Usually they're leading the process and they're a key influencer, but they don't make the actual decision. Of course, we talk a lot about supply continuity and managing risk on the left. This is a big part of their job. And in fact, if you look at everything on this page, that is probably the one thing that if you talk to CPOs or their staff, that probably keeps them up at night, because these other things on the list you can kind of do okay at, and it's not going to get you fired. But if there's a supply continuity issue, if there's something happens in the supply chain or in the supplier network that damages the reputation of their company or their organization, that's going to have a big impact on them personally, and that is something that can get them fired. So they really do lose sleep over this. Next is innovation and growth. So the extent to you as a supplier can help them grow their business. They care about this, and of course they care about their own personal credibility and worth, right? Who doesn't? We all want to get paid more. We all want to move forward in the organization, at least most of us. And so this is what they care about. So part of the trick in selling to these folks is really understanding what do they care about, what are their hot buttons, and talk to them in language that makes sense to them. Okay, so we talked about this. Here's some stats we talked about in the very beginning. Part of the trick to selling to this new buyer is really engaging early in the process. So here's some stats from a study that talked about when do you want to talk to sales folks. So they went out and asked executive buyers, when is it helpful to engage sales? And not surprisingly, and I took that 6-stage buying process I had before and just shortened it down to 4. I consolidated a couple of the buckets. Not surprisingly, when you look at what buyers said, is we want to talk to people very early on. So 35% said I want to talk to them in the very beginning of the buying process when I'm trying to better understand the problem or the opportunity. And 35% said at the next stage, which is really the analysis and when they're developing their strategy. And then you can see, very few people wanted to talk to them towards the middle or end of the process. So what's really clear is you've got to get engaged early, engage with the right message, and engage in the right way to be successful in the future. The other thing, we talked a bit about this, and we'll go into this in just a little more detail, is you've got to influence the criteria they use for the decision. I heard a great quote from a senior VP of supply chain for a very large organization. And I love this quote. I use it. I don't know if it's his own quote, so I won't say who it is, or whether you got it from somewhere else. But his quote is fantastic. He said, from his perspective, the buying decision is about price unless you, the salesperson, make it about something else. So let me say that one more time. The buying decision is about price unless you, as the salesperson, make it about something else. So clearly what he's talking about is you need to shape the criteria, you need to educate, you need to come in and explain to them why it's not about price. So is it quality, is it your risk, is it the total cost of ownership you bring, is it your service and support, is it your innovation? And this is your opportunity to really shape their selection criteria. And I mentioned the word TCO, or total cost of ownership. So as they get more sophisticated as well, that's why you see this little calculator on the screen. One of the things they start to do is something called TCO, which is just looking at the beyond price impact of that solution. So they look at what is the total cost to own, maintain, use, and dispose of the solution, right? And there's research out there. It's a little dated, but the last research I saw said that roughly even 1/3 of even the best run procurement organizations don't routinely do total cost of ownership analysis. So what that says to me from a value perspective and from a supplier perspective is that if you're not clear on your value, they're not doing it for you generally. So you're missing a big opportunity. So it's really about you quantifying the value that you bring. Okay, so when I talk about influencing their criteria, recognize that more sophisticated buyers who sometimes have, buying decision that involves multiple factors. So it's not just price, it could be service, it could be quality, it could be innovation. They have something like what you see here in the screen, this one that starts at the top, this yellow one. I put this one up here because it's a very detailed one, but oftentimes there's an evaluation or selection tool that they use. So part of what you should be doing early in the sales process, after they recognize there's a problem or opportunity, is start to try to get a sense for and shape what is the selection criteria they're going to use and what is the tool they're going to use to actually make the selection. And I can send you some examples after the call if people are interested through the Leverage Points team. But basically, there's a selection tool that goes through a scoring process. And some of these criteria, you guys can't see it on the screen, but some are yes, no criteria. You as a supplier either meet it and you stay in the bid, or you don't meet it and you're out of the bid. And then some others are really weighted based, and they do some scoring based on the various suppliers that come in. So part of what really good suppliers do is very early on in the buying process is sometimes they actually help write this evaluation tool so that as it gets further along in the buying process, you actually start to rule out your competition. So this happens in some markets in Europe where it's public tenders. In the public procurement market, it happens in parts of the U.S. Government procurement, and more as we get into more sophisticated buyers using these type of tools. There are examples I have where the supplier was able to get in early, help shape the criteria, educate the buyer, and really when the RFP comes out, there's only really one qualified supplier. You can't do that all the time, obviously, but to the extent you can get in and shape this, you have a big opportunity. So we'll finish up here in just 2 slides. So what do you need to do is you need to educate them on value. So when I think about value, it's really 4 buckets. It's emotional value, so that's things like your ease to do business, it's your relationship, it's your service. Some of this stuff is hard to quantify what it's worth, but there's definitely value there. There's strategic value, which is basically what do you bring as a supplier? How do you help them innovate? How do you help them grow their business? Do you have new insights, ideas, or capabilities that allow your customer to compete in a different way? And how do you use that? And there's economic value, which is quantifying the impact of your solution relative to the next best alternative. And when we talk about that, it's not only costs, but it's revenue, it's cash, it's anything you're doing to impact the economics of their business. It could be capital management as well. And then, of course, technical value. And technical value is real. Whoever is going to be the user of your service or your technology or solution, they have criteria. It could be ease of use and some other technical factors, and you've got to manage that as well. But when we talk about value, it's really understanding how are you different than competition in all of these dimensions. Okay. And then, the last thing kind of leading up to this is, when you look at the research on professional buyers, what's clear is a large percentage of them, when they've done research and asked professional buyers, do you have a negotiation plan and strategy, and do you have a walkaway point and a backup? And what's clear from the research is the majority of them do not, believe it or not, and many negotiations actually have a negotiation strategy. So part of what the procurement organizations have relied on over time historically, and the good ones don't do this, but historically it's been, to do a real sourcing initiative is a lot of work, but if you can play some games with your suppliers and try to extract some value that way, it's sometimes relatively easy. Oftentimes, sadly, it's relatively easy. And here's we see on the screen is just an example of a fake RFP. The buyer has no intention of switching suppliers. They're just going through the RFP motion to try to get their incumbent's price down. Okay. So with that said, we've gone through a lot about what is the 21st Century Procurement Organization, why are companies implementing that, and why do they need to get better at procurement. We talked about what the implications are for the sales team. So I'll leave you with some to-dos. You could, from our talk, have lots of to-dos, but let's just focus on 5 of these. So one is make sure that your sales process is clearly aligned with their buying process. So if it's misaligned, you're going to have an issue. You need to get clear on your value and be able to quantify it. You need to engage early and have a plan to engage early and really shape their buying criteria. People who do this really, really well, companies that sales teams that do this well, when the RFP or tender comes out, it's really meant for one company. Next is really important as they mature, as procurement organizations mature, you need to have a process for collaboration. So who are you going to collaborate with? How does it work? What value do you give in the collaboration, and what do you expect in exchange? And then lastly, sadly, we do have aggressive negotiators and aggressive buyers out there, and you do need to learn how to play the games. And I think you'll see less of that over time as companies move to a 21st century procurement organization and recognize that you get more value out of collaboration than constant fighting and transactional relationships with their suppliers. But it's still a mix out there, and you still have people who play games, so you got to learn how to play games. Okay, so with that, we'll bring it up to the last slide here. I'll turn it over to Taylor.
Great, thanks, Chris, for those great insights. And we've had a few questions come in during the webinar, and there's still time to enter your question into the panel on your screen. While you're entering, a reminder to complete the 10-second survey while exiting today's webinar to receive a copy of Addressing B2B Sales Challenges and a copy of Selling to Procurement. Now for the Q&A and a brief word about LeveragePoint, I am pleased to introduce LeveragePoint CEO Peyton Marshall.
Thanks, Taylor. And Chris, thank you for a terrific presentation today. Chris made some important connections between customer conversations and customer value. Repeatedly, we see how value propositions can change the sales conversation to make it customer-centric. A recent survey of buyer executives by Forrester found that sales reps who call on them score well in understanding their own company and their own products, but typically come up short in understanding the customer's issues and how they can help. Value propositions deployed by sales recenter the conversation on the customer's business and the customer's problems. Making the conversation customer-centric helps to make transactional dialogues more cooperative and ultimately helps to build collaborative relationships with buyers. At LeveragePoint, we provide a cloud-based platform with access to an organization's best work and best practices. That helps product management, pricing, and marketing quantify value, set prices, and communicate value effectively. And that provides sales and pre-sales teams with ready access to digital, interactive, smart value propositions for their customer conversations. A value proposition in LeveragePoint provides a sales tool for telling your value story to a customer in a dynamic, interactive way. Here you see the value proposition for a hospital ventilator from Chris Provine's latest book, Healthcare Value Selling. The value proposition can be customized to specifics of the conversation and the customer situation to highlight summary messages. Graphics in the value proposition point to your solution's differentiation and the sources of value created for the customer. The value proposition is designed for drilling down into the details of how value is quantified, but only as deeply as members of the customer-facing team want or need to go in any conversation. In Leverage Point, value proposition design is flexible, allowing product managers to create and modify customer-facing displays and graphics to highlight a product's specific value in ways that are effective in customer conversations. Okay, I see we have some great questions so far, and probably not much time, but let's get through them. To answer the most popular one, yes, this webinar is recorded, and the slides and recording will be sent to you in the next day or two, along with the white paper addressing B2B sales challenges and a copy of Selling to Procurement by Chris Provines if you complete the exit survey. First question, Chris. Should I save my value proposition for procurement or use it earlier?
You should use it early and often. At the end of the day, it'll depend on the situation and who you're selling to, what you're selling, and the order of magnitude that, whatever that solution is, what it's going to cost the customer organization. But you also have to honestly do an assessment of the procurement organization and how sophisticated, savvy they are, as well as how much influence they're going to actually have in the buying process and what their real role is. Sometimes their real role is really just to be the rubber stamp and get the paperwork done. That won't stop them from trying to negotiate with you along the way, but if you are selling to a 21st century procurement organization, which was the title of this talk, and you have a very clear value proposition, I would say you should be using that for procurement and using it with your other key influences in the organization to get things moving, because I think procurement can help you in that situation if they really are sophisticated.
Great. Next question. You mentioned supply continuity, you mentioned business risk, you mentioned reputational risk, all as important factors in buyer processes. How do you prepare your sales team to address these? Quantifying value, other means, but how do you prepare sales?
Yeah, it's part of this is an education, and there are in the supply chain world, so we're teaching procurement organizations and people who want to be future procurement people, we teach them about risk. What is risk? What are the different buckets of risk? What is the implications of each of those elements of risk for a business? And so I think part of what you could do if you have a sales team is maybe get a small group of your leading sales folks together and just spend some time on brainstorming what is the risk to the customer for the types of solutions you're selling, and put those into buckets and put some structure around what are the implications for the customer's business if something were to happen in that bucket, whatever that bucket is. So let's use supply continuity as an example. If you believe whatever you're selling, one of the potential areas of risk is supply continuity, you should be trying to figure out, okay, if the customer chooses our competitor and there's a continuity issue, what's the implications for the customer's business? Do they go on back order? Do they have to close down their manufacturing line? If you're selling into a healthcare organization, do they not see patients? What happens? And do you have an advantage in that area of risk? So I would get a group of folks together and do some quick brainstorming, try to put that together, and then you can take that out to the rest of the sales organization and use that as a way to educate them. And I say never use risk as a threat. You should always use it as an opportunity. And when I say threat, don't threaten the customer that you're going to face a lot of risk. What you want to do is educate them. So part of what we're talking about here is just helping your customer make a better buying decision. And if you frame it that way, it's not a threat. You're just helping them understand there's some more risk involved in what they're buying that maybe they understand. And that happens, quite honestly. Sometimes as a buyer, even though you're schooled and prepared and you're educated on, you need to be thinking about risk. They sometimes don't know the technology as well as you. They don't know what could go wrong. So it's your opportunity to educate them.
Great. Next question. How do you sell against unbundling?
Yeah, that's a tough one because, if you've been selling let's go to legal services, you've been bundling in, doing do business with us as a law firm, and we're going to charge you out at a certain rate. And then the procurement people come in and say, I tell you what, we'll take that super specialist you have for the patent litigation, but all those other people you're trying to charge us $400 an hour for, we're going to outsource that to India and have someone else do that at $25 an hour. That's really tough. I think what you have to spend strategically some time as a company to think about is, what is your offering strategy? Where do you create value? How do you put your offers together? And then maybe spend some time thinking about the different segments you sell into and whether or not the bundle works in some segments and not in others. Maybe you unbundle for people who are really price sensitive, or what I call price buyers. And maybe you bundle when you have a customer who really wants to think about you as a strategic supplier. So I think one of the things you should probably think about from a bundling standpoint is unbundling creates complexity often, because now you go from one supplier to two or many, right? And if your customer is interested in reducing the number of suppliers and reducing complexity in their business, one of the selling points I would give for bundling is, listen, you reduce suppliers, we'll give you one point of contact. And maybe the other thing you can do around that is offer some guarantee related to the bundle. So as a buyer, if I unbundle and save money, you should be able to offer me some guarantee that I'm better off through your bundle.
Okay, we've got lots of questions, a number of questions on incentivization, but I think only time for one more. How do you identify buying professionals who are rewarded on value instead of price?
Yeah, great question. I would ask them, and you have to be careful how you do this. You have to have obviously a relationship with them, but ask them how they're measured. You know, what's their scorecard? Most well-run organizations will have a scorecard. They'll tell you exactly how they're measured, or they'll give you some sense of it. And what you want to do is try to probe them and understand, do they look at pure price as savings, or are they looking at total cost of ownership? Will they give you credit for innovation? If you help them grow their business or compete strategically, is that something they get credit for in their organization or not? And you can have those, if you have a relationship, you can have those honest conversations with them. You obviously have to educate yourself on it first, but it's a good opportunity to have that type of conversation.
Great. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Taylor?
Well, thank you, Chris and Peyton. And as a reminder, don't miss Leverage Point's next Value Strategies webinar, The Importance of Winning the Sale Before You Win the Order, 3 Steps to Build a High-Converting B2B Pipeline in 2016. And this is presented by Andy Paul, founder and CEO of Zero Time Selling. So that's it from us for today, and thank you for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful rest of the week and holiday season. Take care.